Thank you very much. It's an honor to be associated with the University of Chicago on any occasion, so I'm glad to be here and glad to see so many people. Thanks for coming out late at night. Some of what I'm going to say has already appeared on our blog, so if you're interested, I posted an article the day before the election. It was called "Try to See It My Way," which was deliberately invoking an old Beatles song. Its message is that if you were Chinese, you wouldn't want to be hearing what Americans were saying about you, and you may not react very well to it. And it becomes more and more incumbent upon Americans to be aware of what they're saying and the impact it can have in China, and also in the other direction. So the analysis I'm going to do now for you is going to expose you to some very harsh rhetoric that characterized our presidential campaign. You'll hear Governor Romney frequently calling China cheaters and cheat, and President Obama will use this term as well, but he'll frame it in a way that is not specifically directed toward China. It's just that it's unmistakably related to China. He'll talk more about the vigorous enforcement of our trade laws. So I'm going to find for you these video clips, or James will help me find them. One of the things they debated was what our overall relationship is. Are we friend or foe, or is it an adversary, or is China our partner? Now those terms, adversary and partner and so on, didn't show up in the second debate. They all showed up in the third debate.
China's both an adversary, but also a potential partner in the international community if it's following the rules.
This can't go on. I want a great relationship with China. China can be our partner, but that doesn't mean they can just roll all over us and steal our jobs on an unfair basis. And so we can be a partner with China. We don't have to be an adversary in any way, shape, or form. We can work with them.
Don't have to be an adversary in any way, shape, or form. Have you heard anything in these two discussions that would suggest that Governor Romney didn't think China was an adversary? Yet he proposes here in the third debate that not in any way, shape, or form should China be considered an adversary.
We can collaborate with them if they're willing to be responsible.
And we believe China can be a partner, but we're also sending a very clear signal that America is a Pacific power, that we are going to have a presence there.
Now that proposition has been reinforced very recently, as you probably have observed in the news. The pivot to Asia is being reinforced by a visit throughout the region by the Secretary of Defense. We're going to see the Secretary of State again. The President's coming back through the region, all in conjunction with the election, all sending a very clear message that the United States is going to concentrate its foreign policy more in this region. And this point the President made very clear in this debate. So one topic, friend or foe, adversary, partner, left out in question, suggesting a rivalry at least. Second big subject that I want to focus on is jobs. Jobs have been treated in these debates and in U.S. policy largely as a zero-sum game. The jobs are either in the United States or they're somewhere else, and they're in China perhaps. But listen very closely to how the jobs debate is framed here, because the phrasing and even the structure of the sentences is very, very careful. And if you don't listen carefully, you'll find it very misleading.
The place where we've seen manufacturing go has been China. China is now the largest manufacturer in the world. It used to be the United States of America. A lot of good people have lost jobs. 500,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost in the last 4 years.
500,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost in the last 4 years. Nowhere have you heard, nowhere does either one of them mention the recession. 4 years of recession, we lost manufacturing jobs. Notice the structure of the sentence. The sentence in which he refers to the lost manufacturing jobs follows the sentence about China. He doesn't say that the manufacturing jobs were lost to China, because they weren't. but he wants you to hear the proposition that jobs are going to China. China's become the leading manufacturing center. We lost 250,000 manufacturing jobs. No mention of the recession, and there's a semicolon, obviously, in that sentence, so that those manufacturing jobs were not necessarily lost to China, but if you're not listening carefully, that's what you're supposed to think.
That's total over the last 4 years.
All manufactured in China. One of the major reasons is labor is so much cheaper here. How do you convince a great American company to bring that manufacturing back here?
The answer is very straightforward. We can compete with anyone in the world as long as the playing field is level.
Now, this sentence is for someone who does what I do much of my life, which is international trade, one of the most stunning moments in the three debates, because this is a standard sentence of Democrats. The mantra of protectionist positions in international trade is that we can compete with anyone, provided it's a level playing field. And the code is that we can't compete, our private enterprises can't compete with foreign countries, with the governments. And if a level playing field means there aren't subsidies, a level playing field means that we're competing commercially and economically with other private enterprises. But when the enterprises are not effectively private, we can't compete with them. That's not fair, that's not a level playing field. Traditionally in our politics, it's always presumed that the Republican Party is free traders and the Democratic Party is protectionist because the Democratic Party is wedded to protecting trade unions and workers, and they are the most protectionist forces in our society. Historically, it turns out that's not really quite true. It's much truer that Congress is protectionist. And if you look at trade reform over the last 80 years, and at least going back to the formulation of the GATT in the 1930s, you'll find that most of the initiatives to reform trade and liberalize it were taken by Democratic presidents. And many of the more severe protectionist actions, like the voluntary restraints on steel, were taken by Republican presidents. So we have a lot of mythology about this. But in the rhetoric, the language of protection has always been associated with Democrats, and this sentence that is delivered by Governor Romney is straight out of the trade union and Democratic playbook. So here we're hearing the Republican candidate who's making his appeal essentially to the trade unions. And what you're going to hear, if you listen closely then, is the President of the United States is going to be the Republican in this debate.
China's been cheating over the years. One, by holding down the value of their currency. Number two, by stealing our intellectual property, our designs, our patents, our technology. There's even an Apple store in China that's a counterfeit Apple store, selling counterfeit goods. They hack into our computers. We will have to have people play on a fair basis. That's number one.
Andy, there's some jobs that are not going to come back.
It's the Democratic president saying some of these jobs aren't going to come back. This is also one of the more remarkable moments in these debates. It's a candid statement, it's true, and I'm going to elaborate on it when we get to the discussion of the tire safeguard. But here's the president saying, okay, we're not going to get those jobs back. This is a very courageous statement for him to make. Something told him, some poll told him that this was okay to say.
Because they're low-wage, low-skill jobs. I want high-wage, high-skill jobs. That's why we have to emphasize manufacturing. That's why we have to invest in advanced manufacturing. That's why we've got to make sure that we've got the best science and research in the world. And when we talk about deficits, if we're adding to our deficit for tax cuts for folks who don't need them, and we're cutting investments in research and science that will create the next Apple, create the next new innovation that will sell products around the world, we will lose that race.
They have to manufacture goods and put people to work. They have about 20 million rather people coming out of the farms every year, coming into the cities, needing jobs. So they want the economy to work. I've watched year in and year out as companies have shut down and people have lost their jobs because China has not played by the same rules.
And we've put unprecedented trade pressure on China. That's why exports have significantly increased under my presidency.
Okay, second debate, exports have significantly increased under my presidency. Now recall that approximately 3 years ago, the President declared as an objective of his administration to double U.S. exports within the period of his presidency. This was not a complete success, even though the target was not as high as it might have sounded rhetorically. So in the second debate, he's simply saying exports have increased significantly during his presidency.
That's going to help to create jobs here. U.S. exports have doubled since I came into office to China.
Okay, so they did double, but to China in his presidency.
But we've also set up a...
And he didn't seem to be fully aware of that in the second debate. So somewhere between the second and third debate, he found out just what the measures were, and he was able to say, okay, I did double the exports, just like I said I was going to China, which wasn't very hard to do because we weren't exporting much to China when he declared the policy.
Task force for trade that goes after anybody who is taking advantage of American workers or businesses and not creating a level playing field. We've brought twice as many cases against unfair trading practices than the previous administration, and we've won every single one that's been decided.
We won every single one. Okay, that's the second debate.
We have brought more cases against China for violating trade rules than the previous administration had done in 2 terms. And we've won just about every case.
Just about every case, because he didn't win them all.
That we filed, that has been decided.
China has been a currency manipulator for years and years and years. And the President has a regular opportunity to label them as a currency manipulator, but refuses to do so. On day one, I will label China a currency manipulator, which will allow me as President to be able to put in place, if necessary, tariffs.
Which will allow me as President to put in place tariffs. Now, somewhere between the second and the third debate, someone told him that the President doesn't have those powers. Because in the third debate, with some very slippery language, he corrects it. Because there are no such powers. Declaring China a currency manipulator does not enable the President to do anything at all. And in fact, during that week, he had surrogates out saying, don't worry about the currency manipulation thing. It really doesn't matter. It goes to the IMF, and there are no powers associated with it, which is correct. There are no powers associated with it. He would need an act of Congress to amend the trade law such that currency manipulation could be considered a subsidy. And only under the subsidies regime could there any action be taken, and the President couldn't take that action. So he's telling us first that on day one, he's going to declare this, and it's going to give him powers as President to act. That's what he tells us in the second debate.
Where I believe that they are taking unfair advantage of our manufacturers.
That's why on day one, I will label them a currency manipulator, which allows us to apply tariffs where they're taking jobs.
Well, Governor.
Which allows us, no longer I as President, and to apply tariffs, but he doesn't say how exactly, because it will still require an act of Congress. So he's backing down from the position on currency manipulation, and much more aggressively among surrogates who are insisting that this is not what it's made out to be. Now consider as well what currency manipulation is intended to mean. The word manipulate is from a Latin root. It's with your hands, mani, and you've got to get your hands on something. You've got to be doing something. What China did was make a bet that the US dollar would fall, and it attached its currency to the US dollar. It was a good bet. But had China attached itself to the US dollar and made a bad bet, and the dollar had gone up, the Chinese currency would have gone up, and then no one would be complaining. By contrast, the quantitative easing that has characterized the policies of the Federal Reserve in the United States has increased substantially the supply of dollars. So in the week between these two debates, Brazil accused the United States of currency manipulation and said that it was going to bring the matter to the IMF. So in fact, if we think about what currency manipulation means, it's very remote from this debate. And the president understands this. This is one of the things that he does understand because it's not a trade question. And so his answer will be changed a little bit. It'll be nuanced between the second and third debate. But he doesn't take the bait from Governor Romney, who says, well, you have a regular opportunity, which is annually. Every year it comes before the president. He could declare them a currency manipulator, however meaningful it might be, or not meaningful. And he has always resisted doing that. And there's been pressure in the Congress to do it. The Romney surrogates wanted to emphasize that the two bills that had been in Congress for the purpose of giving currency manipulation some meaning, that Governor Romney hadn't endorsed either one of the bills, something that never came up in the context of the debates.
Let me just ask you, if you declare them a currency manipulator on day one, some people are saying you're just going to start a trade war with China on day one. Isn't there a risk that that could happen?
Well, they sell us about this much stuff every year, and we sell them about this much stuff every year. So it's pretty clear who doesn't want a trade war. And there's one going on right now, which we don't know about.
So this part I just include for amusement. There's one going on, but we don't know about it. And it's a silent war, and we're losing. It's rhetorically one of the higher moments of the debates, but it has no specific meaning that I can convey to you. I just found it amusing.
Silent one, and they're winning. We have enormous trade imbalance with China, and it's worse this year than last year, and it's worse last year than the year before. And so we have to understand that we can't just surrender and lose jobs year in and year out. We have to say to our friends in China, look, you guys are playing aggressively, we understand it, but this can't keep on going. You can't keep on holding down the value of your currency, stealing our intellectual property, counterfeiting our products, selling them around the world, even into the United States.
And as far as currency manipulation, the currency's actually gone up 11% since I've been president because we have pushed them.
Okay, now, apart from the fact that the currency change didn't have much to do with our pressure in China, in the second debate, the president tells us that the currency has gone up about 11% during his administration, which is correct. But listen to the different fact that he offers in the third debate.
Hard. Actually, currencies are at their most advantageous point for U.S. exporters since 1993. We absolutely have to make more progress.
A number of trade events occurred in the closing weeks of the campaign, and I think some of them had a lot to do with the campaign itself. But they create risks for what happens now that the election is over. Chinese leadership has become quite sophisticated in understanding that we say a lot of things during campaigns that go away afterwards, and we have a lot of commentators who like to emphasize that point, who like to explain that China shouldn't be very concerned about what we're saying because it's all campaign rhetoric, and mostly they get it, but not always and not completely, because some of the actions are exceptional. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is a committee chaired by the U.S. Treasury that screens foreign investments for national security risk. It was created many years ago, but it was given new teeth after 9/11, and it's a continuing concern of China. China complains constantly that CFIUS, as it's called, is an obstacle to Chinese investment in the United States, and that it is screening against Chinese investment in particular because China is perceived as a national security threat. And that's consistent with a perception that our export controls are particularly limiting on China. The president in 25 years has never ruled in a CFIUS case to block an investment or unravel an investment that's been made. And in fact, although CFIUS, for example, in the years from 2009 through 2011, received and reviewed 269 potential investments, of the 269 potential investments, not a single one was turned down by the president. And only 13 were withdrawn upon review, and that was a result of negotiations that didn't work out or for whatever other reason, but they were withdrawn. So CFIUS, in fact, may appear to be somewhat threatening, And indeed, China virtually copied the U.S. law and now has instituted something similar, but without defining any of the terms, so that the government in China has much more discretion over the process than the U.S. government has. Nevertheless, CFIUS, perceived as a threat to investment, has not acted much as one until perhaps now. At the end of September, the President intervened, for the first time in 25 years that a President has done so, about a wind farm that was under development in Oregon. The Chinese owner of the company is Sanyi, and the wholly owned subsidiary in the United States is the Rawls Corporation. The Rawls Corporation bought wind farm and started to move in to install turbines of its own manufacture from China and towers from China, as well as using some that were already there in the wind farm that it bought. Now, President Hu Jintao and President Obama met in 2009 here in Beijing and agreed that the two countries should collaborate on the development of green technologies for energy, and specifically solar and wind. The outcome of that agreement was that China took it seriously, more seriously than the United States, and started pumping a lot of money into developing solar and wind. The United States turned around and brought trade cases against China for subsidizing the development of solar and wind. And now that it is the national policy of both countries to develop solar power and to develop wind power, our trade laws are blocking the public policy, which I'll elaborate on in a few minutes. So in this case of the Oregon wind farm, it is located very close to a naval facility. And it is a secret naval facility, not that it exists, but in what it does is develop drone technology. 2 years ago, there was a Chinese proposed investment to buy a gold mine in Colorado. It was subjected to a CFIUS review, and through discussion it was withdrawn. It was withdrawn because the United States said that it was too close to an Air Force facility and that no foreign country should have an investment in the land next to that facility. And it was argued that that would have applied to anybody. It wouldn't have mattered whether it was French or Chinese. But now, this project is within the explicit domain of the public policy of both countries to develop wind power, where already there was a wind farm now being expanded by a Chinese-owned corporation. It was not submitted for CFIUS review. Now, CFIUS review is not mandatory. You can submit it, or you can proceed with your project. If you proceed with your project, it can be unraveled. The Foreign Investment National Security Act of 2007 created a safe harbor for national security review. If you submit your project before you make your investment, you're promised a 30-day review, and if you clear the 30-day review, you're in safe harbor, you can make your investment, it will not be unraveled. We counsel clients all the time that if they have the slightest doubt about a project in which they're going to enter, that they submit it for CFIUS review. They almost always get approved, and if they don't, there'll be a negotiation to sort it out. They almost never get turned down. For whatever reason, in this project, there was no submission for CFIUS review. They made the investment, they started building, they brought in towers, and then it started to unravel. They conferred with the Department of Defense, and they agreed to move some of the towers further away from the naval facility. They thought they'd resolve the question. They negotiated with the Federal Aviation Administration to make sure there were no issues about the towers with respect to the drones and planes in the area. So they were convinced, the Rawls Corporation was convinced, that it had satisfied whatever national security issues may arise. CFIUS took it up sua sponte, unraveled it, decided in September that they couldn't continue with the project. The Rawls Corporation promptly went to court to try to prevent that from happening, even though CFIUS review is not subject to judicial appeal. And then the President stepped in himself and ordered that they abandon the site, move off it. They could send non-Chinese, they could send Americans to go and clear out their towers, but they could not themselves go back onto the property. Now, In our transparent legal system, this is the one black box. We don't explain exactly what goes on in CFIUS review. The President doesn't have to explain his order. And what I know about this project is not because I'm involved in it, but because the Rolls Corporation has now sued under a law that says you can't sue. And they're in U.S. District Court, and I've read the pleadings. The pleadings raise some very interesting questions. The question about whether you can challenge the President for unraveling your deal probably will fail, in my view, at least reading the initial pleadings, because it will fall to the Curtis-Wright doctrine of the 1936 Supreme Court decision that it guarantees the President his supremacy over foreign affairs and over national security. But this is also a taking under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, because the President made them abandon the property, lose all of the value of their investment, and it's being done without just compensation. So it is possible that the court will accept jurisdiction over the constitutional question, but not necessarily over the statutory question related to CFIUS. So this will unfold in a way that may tell us a whole lot more about what was going on in this case. The U.S. defense so far, the government defense in the case so far, is to claim no jurisdiction, you can't appeal the law, and it will try to block any discussion. What the Rolls Corporation and Sany are banking on is that the United States will not fully defend itself because of national security, and therefore will be obliged to yield in the case. We'll find out. A simple Google map search would have told the Rolls Corporation that it was acquiring a wind farm and building very close to a naval facility. And in the shadow of the first gold experience in Colorado, that might have communicated to someone that perhaps they should have submitted it for CFIUS review. So why they didn't do that is one of the pregnant questions. When you put a 100-meter tower and a whole field of them, it isn't hard to put up a camera, and therefore there are plausible concerns about national security, even though nothing's been articulated about that. And if you took it from the business side, they are simply investing in the very business that both countries agreed they should be investing in. Other things happened in the campaign, or during the campaign, and the President alluded to them, although he didn't name them in the debate. The TransPacific Partnership negotiations, the TPP negotiations, were accelerated in the fall. The administration had hoped to conclude those negotiations before the election, or at least before the first of the year. That's not going to happen. And in the trade community, there's some disagreement about what the President's powers really are in this regard. He has not been granted trade promotion authority, what used to be called fast-track authority, from Congress. So his negotiating authority for international trade agreements is uncertain. It's unclear that he can submit this to Congress for an up or down vote, as you could if he had trade promotion authority. The administration is contending that it can do so because it was initiated in the Bush administration when the President did have trade promotion authority. Personally, I doubt that legal analysis and think that the President would have to subject the agreement to full congressional review, which would sink it in a heartbeat, because Congress will amend it and then our trade partners will not agree to it. But it is the only significant trade agreement that is currently being negotiated. And it emphasizes that the United States is a Pacific power and that it's negotiating with other countries other than China in forming trade relationships. It was not initiated by the United States, it was initiated by other Asian countries that asked the United States to come in, but the overall objective was plainly to create a balance in the region with respect to China. There have also been the events in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and one might ask, what is the United States doing getting engaged in a dispute between Japan and China over islands? And the President, I think, made that very clear by saying, we're a Pacific power, we're going to keep the sea lanes clear, we're going to be present. And that is plainly a message to China. When we talk about defense budgets, we always should remember that the United States has not only the largest defense budget in the world, but a defense budget that's larger than all of the rest of the countries in the world combined. So even though China is expanding its defense budget and talking about being a naval power, this is not even remotely a threat or concern to the United States. It is a concern, however, to the other countries in the region, which is why the United States is making clear its presence in the region militarily as well as economically. We've also had and this toughness, you kept hearing the president in the debate talk about who was going to be tough with respect to China and tough on China. Well, tough always translates in part into security. So I believe that some of the pressure on these questions perhaps was provoked by China, but also was stimulated by the election campaign. We've had an increase in the WTO complaints on green technology in particular and on auto parts, and the president kept emphasizing that he's bringing cases, that he's putting on this trade pressure. Now, I'll be happy to discuss with you, but I won't do it in the central context here, just what it means to bring a WTO complaint and what the consequences are and how long it takes, because I've done these. And the suggestion that you can really maintain fairness in world trade by relying on the WTO is ambitious. The tires case is one of my favorites, but I need to explain to you a little trade law in order to make it comprehensible. In the trade law and trade remedies, there are three principal areas of remedy: anti-dumping, countervailing duties or subsidies, and safeguards. In the first two, the president has no authority. They're controlled by statute. They're in the hands of the U.S. Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission. They have nothing to do with the president. Safeguards are the only thing that the WTO permits in which you can impose a quota. Quotas are prohibited completely in international trade except for a safeguard. Now, the quota is permitted in a safeguard because the concept of the safeguard is that the other country, the country against whom you've brought your complaint, hasn't done anything wrong. The product they're shipping doesn't have to have been dumped. It doesn't have to have been subsidized. All that has to happen is that a large quantity of that product is suddenly swamping your market. And when that happens, your domestic industry is unable to compete. You're then allowed a breathing space, a safeguard. You need to demonstrate serious harm. The serious is in the statute to increase the level of harm that you might have needed had it been a dumping question or a subsidies question. The level of harm has to be higher. You have to demonstrate the harm to your industry, and you have to prove that this surge took place. And then there's a third thing you have to show. You have to have a plan. The plan has to be that you will adjust. You're entitled to a quota or some other trade remedy for a period of 2 to 3 years. When it's over, everything goes back to the way it was, because after all, the country you're complaining about didn't do anything wrong. It just shipped a lot of goods at once. So you were given a breathing space to deal with that by limiting the goods coming in, whether it was through a quota or a tariff rate quota, whatever remedy the president chooses, because it's the president who has to decide whether there'll be a safeguard. So you have to have a plan, and you have to demonstrate that over the course of your plan, over the 2 or 3 years you're given for breathing space, when it's over, you'll still be in business. Now, the tire safeguard emerged because American companies manufacturing cheap tires in the United States decided that they didn't want to manufacture cheap tires in the United States anymore. They only wanted to manufacture high quality and high performance tires. And they offshored the manufacture of the cheap tires to China. They moved the factories there for the purpose of manufacturing the cheap tires there. So the complaint about the cheap tires then coming into the United States and competing with the high performance or more expensive tires was a complaint that didn't come from the companies. They did that to themselves. But the trade law allows trade unions to bring a trade complaint. So this complaint was brought by the trade unions. No company participated in the complaint. This created a big problem in the trade law, because who was going to make up the plan? How were you going to adjust? None of the companies was going to adjust. They weren't going to move the factories back. They weren't going to transfer the jobs back. They had made their decision. They were going to stay in China. They were going to make the cheap tires in China and the expensive tires in the United States. They weren't going anywhere. So when the case was brought, the president was fairly obliged, especially because China managed its defense very badly in this case, was fairly obliged to sign off on it without a plan. And it has now expired, and no one questioned its expiration. So it's come and gone. But the president said, I saved 1,000 jobs. No one has ever asked or pointed out where those 1,000 jobs are. When he said those workers are grateful, they're not workers who made cheap tires, because those companies didn't come back to make cheap tires. Those factories didn't reopen to make cheap tires in the United States. So who are those 1,000 workers? Nobody knows. Governor Romney didn't know enough to ask. And the president was never obliged to explain. So I, at least, have never heard who those 1,000 workers are. It's still only 1,000 workers. The Peterson Institute, a think tank in Washington, not fully respected for everything it says on international economics, but it did an analysis of these 1,000 jobs with reference to the cost to consumers of the competing tires coming in when you impose the safeguard and block those cheap tires from coming in. They calculate that the 1,000 jobs cost $1.1 million per job as a result of the safeguard. So this became, as you heard in the second and third debates, a primary interest of the president. I saved 1,000 jobs. Governor Romney didn't get it. He thought I was being too tough on China, but those 1,000 workers are grateful. Never questioned. Never questioned in the campaign. Whoever those 1,000 workers were, whatever the benefit was. And I don't think the president fully understood what he was signing off on either. So, just to offer a little interpretation of where this takes us. It's being suggested in the United States that the president doesn't have a mandate. Presidents never really have mandates. One shouldn't exaggerate the mandate. But I believe he's now the first president in 60 years to win the popular vote and the Electoral College in a majority twice. That's beginning to be a mandate. And the results in Congress suggest something similar. In the United States, we elect 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years, staggered 6-year terms. So 1/3 of the Senate was up for election this time around, and 23 of those seats were Democratic seats. So Democrats were considered to be very vulnerable. Republicans expected to retake the Senate in this election. And the net result of the election was a net gain of 2 seats for the Democratic Party. That's how badly the Republicans fared in the Senate races. That has to be suggestive of a broader impact and a broader mandate for the president. Even the House of Representatives, which showed much smaller change, 7 seats to the advantage of the Democratic Party. In many of those races, there have been changes that also suggest a weakening of the Republican Party. In addition, because the president has something resembling a mandate, he has also passed the 2 most difficult features of his domestic policy. No longer will the health care system be put in doubt. It might have been in doubt had he lost the election. It's now going to be the law, fully implemented in 2014. And the Dodd-Frank bill, the disciplines imposed on Wall Street, will also not be repealed. Will also stand. These were his 2 biggest challenges once he was able to retard the economic decline that he inherited when he was elected the first time. Past the 2 biggest hurdles, and remembering that health care was something that torpedoed the Clinton administration in its first 2 years, these are now accomplished. So the president now enters his 2nd term with the freedom to pursue a bolder agenda. First, to deal with the fiscal cliff, which I believe will be resolved in the next 3 or 4 weeks, and then to move on to immigration. His 2 biggest priorities will be domestic policy. So when he gets to foreign affairs and trade, there'll be 2 dimensions, and they won't be contested. One will be to stay tough on trade because of his debt to the trade unions in his election, and the other will be to redefine American foreign policy consistent with his Cairo speech that he was unable to pursue in the first term. So what do I think we should expect? More trade cases. They're like shadow boxing in many ways, but we'll see more of them, and they'll be mostly about Chinese products. But China will also bring more cases. Now, curiously, China likes to bring their cases to the WTO. They don't like to bring cases under U.S. law. And I've counseled them many times that WTO solutions are all prospective and don't help, therefore, their exports and enter the U.S. market. To do that, they've got to go into U.S. courts. The government of China does not want to go into U.S. courts. And therefore, the products do get blocked because the U.S. law is retrospective and can enable you to recover and therefore to ship to the United States. The WTO doesn't help you do that. And we're going to have more discussion, a lot more discussion, over this debate that you saw, friend or foe, adversary or partner. A Chinese resentment of the notion that the United States is blocking its ascension as the leading global power by the end of the 21st century. And an American wariness that we have a contest of two very different systems, much like the Cold War, and particular concerns about individual freedoms and human rights and those things that in China don't satisfy Western standards, and capitalism doesn't resolve those questions. So Americans will be concerned continuously about those values that it finds fundamental, and China will be concerned that the United States is not encouraging its development, but in fact blocking its path. And we will hear continuously in the United States what you heard from both candidates over and over again, that everybody has to play by the rules, remembering that the trade rules were written by us. And some of these things are not within the control of the president. In particular, as I've been suggesting to you, the green technologies, the trade cases, are not within his powers by statute. The solar cell case was just resolved last week by the U.S. International Trade Commission. Very high tariffs are going to be imposed on Chinese solar cells being exported to the United States. Many of them will not be able to export. Some Chinese companies will be in serious jeopardy as a result. And the wind tower case, in which I'm counsel to Siemens, we're going before the International Trade Commission in about 3 weeks, in the shadow of the solar cell case. Now, these are cases in which our public policy is to develop green technology, and our trade law says we shouldn't. The wind towers are steel towers that are manufactured in the United States only in the Midwest. The cost and logistics of moving them overland are prohibitive. So if you're developing a wind farm on a coast or on an island, on Hawaii or on Puerto Rico, you need to get them by ship. And to get them by ship, it makes much more sense to get them from Asia than to get them from an American manufacturer who can't really deliver them from the Midwest. If the U.S. industry as it's self-defined, the tower manufacturers, prevail in this case, there'll be no more access to the towers from Asia, and we won't be able to develop wind farms on the East Coast, the West Coast, or on the islands. Fundamentally contrary to what our public policy is supposed to be about green technology. So an idea that I've been touting this week is that the only way to address this kind of problem is not through trade cases and not through these kinds of disputes. It's going to require an international agreement. I've been suggesting that the new government of China take the initiative and call immediately for a global conference to be held here in Beijing 18 months from now on climate change. But that in making that call, it put on the table a proposal, a concrete, serious proposal, for a quantity of gigawatts to be delivered through solar power and wind power that will offset the development of coal-fired plants, in which China is opening coal-fired plants on an almost daily basis. Now, this shouldn't be all that difficult to do, because a central issue in the solar cell case was that China has been inundating the U.S. market with cheap solar cells, but not using them at home. It's been manufacturing and exporting and inundating the U.S. market. The correct answer would appear to be use those solar cells in China. Make them here, use them here. And if you do that, you can do it at the quantity and level and rate that will offset a lot of the problems, such that you don't need a carbon tax. You just need to generate more electricity in a clean way. And you can do it this way. And the same would be true of the wind towers. And if China were to put a concrete proposal on the table, committed to a development of this kind of energy within a reasonable time horizon, it would be irresistible, in my view, for the United States to stay away from that conference. The President would like to deal with climate change, but politically he can't. And politically it never showed up during the campaign, never mentioned. But now's the time to make it happen. The President has an agenda that's clear. The initiative needs to come from China, and China's in a position to undertake that initiative, especially because these trade cases are going to shut these products out of the U.S. market. Finally, we're going to talk more about security, but I don't think the security discussions are going to be very meaningful, because the United States has already committed itself to security in the region. It's committed itself as a Pacific power. That promise that the President made in the debates is serious. That's where the United States is going. And therefore, the relationship will principally revolve around trade. And some of those trade questions cannot be resolved through the WTO and through the trade law. They need to be resolved through international agreement. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you or take questions or anything else you'd like. Thanks for listening.